There is a sentence that has been sitting in the American literary tradition for nearly 200 years, waiting for you to be ready to hear it. It was written by a man who had buried his first wife at 29, his beloved brother at 27, and his firstborn son at 5 years old. A man who had resigned from his church, walked away from his career, sailed alone to Europe in grief, and returned with something so clarifying, so uncomfortable, so permanently true that it has never stopped disturbing people since he first said it aloud. To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment. His name was Ralph Waldo Emerson, and the essay he published in 1841, Self-Reliance, is the most bracing, most uncomfortable, most necessary argument for living by your own truth that American literature has ever produced. Not self-help, not motivation, not the shallow modern instruction to believe in yourself. Something far older and far harder than that. The radical, demanding, almost frightening proposition that the inner voice you have been second-guessing, suppressing, managing, and apologizing for your entire life is the only authority that was ever worth listening to. There is a tax that modern life collects from almost everyone, quietly, continuously, without ever sending a bill. It is the tax of conformity. Not the dramatic conformity of totalitarian regimes or enforced orthodoxy, the soft, social, almost invisible conformity of a person who has learned through decades of feedback from family, culture, institution, and crowd which parts of themselves are acceptable and which parts need to be managed, hidden, softened, made more palatable for the room. You learned this early, before you had language for it. The expression on a parent's face when you said the wrong thing, the laughter in a classroom when you were different, the slow, accumulated understanding that certain versions of you were welcomed and certain versions were not. And so you became very skilled, most of us become extraordinarily skilled at presenting the version that is welcomed, at reading the room, at adjusting, moderating, editing the self in real time to fit the expectations of whoever is watching. And at 50 or 55, you look in the mirror and realize, with the clarity that is almost physical, that you have been doing this for so long that you are no longer certain which version is the real one. Emerson saw this coming in 1841. He watched a young nation building itself on borrowed standards, European aesthetics, inherited religion, second-hand philosophy, and refusing to trust its own original perception. And he wrote something that was, in its moment, genuinely scandalous. Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. To understand what Emerson meant by self-reliance and why it is so much more demanding than it sounds, we need to understand the man who wrote it. Emerson was not a person for whom trust came easily. He was a Unitarian minister who stood in his own pulpit one Sunday in 1832 and told his congregation that he could no longer administer communion in good conscience because he no longer believed it meant what the church said it meant. He resigned, walked away from the career he had trained for, the institution that had shaped him, the role that organized his entire identity. At 29, already a widower, already grieving, he stepped off the edge of everything that had defined him. And what he found on the other side of that terrifying step was himself. Not a finished self, not a self with all the answers, but a self that was genuinely, originally, irreducibly his own. And from that place, that uncomfortable, unsupported, magnificent place of standing on his own ground, he began to think and write with a clarity and a power that changed American intellectual history. He was not advising you to do what he did. He was not asking you to resign your position or abandon your institutions. He was saying something quieter and more radical than that. He was saying, stop letting other people's thinking do the work that only your own thinking can do. The central argument of self-reliance can be stated in a single sentence that takes a lifetime to fully inhabit. What is true for you in your private heart is true for all. Let me unwrap that, because it sounds simple, and it is anything but. Emerson believed, with the force of someone who had tested this against real loss and real solitude, that every human being has access to a direct perception of truth. Not borrowed truth, not handed down truth, not the truth of experts or authorities, or the accumulated consensus of people who are equally uncertain. The truth of your own direct experience, your own irreducible perception of what is real and what matters and what is right. And he believed, radically, scandalously believed, that this perception, when you are honest enough to access it and courageous enough to trust it, is not merely personal, it is universal. The things you know in your bones, the moral clarity you feel in certain moments, the recognition that arrives not through argument but through direct seeing, these are not your private quirks or your subjective preferences. These are you, participating in the intelligence that runs through everything. I know, it sounds like a lot, but stay with it for a moment, because here is how it lands in ordinary life. How many times have you known something clearly, certainly, with the particular quiet certainty that doesn't need to justify itself, and then talked yourself out of it, deferred to the opinion of someone louder, submitted your own perception to the judgment of a crowd that, in the end, knew less than you did about what was true? Emerson would say, with the patient exasperation of a man who spent his life watching intelligent people do this, that this is not humility, this is not open-mindedness, this is the abandonment of the only faculty you were ever given that can actually see. There's a passage in Self-Reliance that I have returned to more times than I can count. Emerson is writing about the way we dismiss our own best thoughts. In every work of genius, we recognize our own rejected thoughts. They come back to us with a certain alienated majesty. Our own rejected thoughts. Think about that. You read something, a poem, an essay, a sentence in a book, and something in you lights up. Something recognizes it, not because it is new, because it is you. Because somewhere in your own unspoken inner life, you already knew this. You had already thought it, felt it, perceived it, and then rejected it, filed it under too obvious or too simple, or probably wrong because no one else seems to be saying it. And then someone said it. Someone with credentials, someone with an audience, someone with the confidence you were not certain you deserved, and suddenly it was wisdom. Emerson is not being bitter about this. He is being precise. He is identifying the exact mechanism by which we consistently, systematically, structurally undervalue our own perception and the cost of that undervaluing across the entire span of a life. The ideas you did not pursue, the directions you did not follow, the things you knew were right that you talked yourself out of because the room was not yet ready for them, the self you did not fully become because the culture had not yet given you permission. Emerson would say, you were waiting for permission that was never going to come, because the only permission that was ever real was yours to give. There's a concept Emerson introduces, almost in passing, as if it is obvious, that is the most quietly devastating observation in the entire essay. He calls it the Hobgoblin of Little Minds. Here's the context. He's writing about consistency, about the way we feel obligated, socially, morally, almost compulsively, to be consistent with positions we have taken in the past, to honor the choices we made as younger, less experienced, less clear-eyed versions of ourselves. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines.
A foolish consistency. Not all consistency, the foolish kind. The kind that says, I must continue to believe what I believed at 30 because changing my mind would make me look inconsistent. The kind that says, I must remain the person my family and friends expect me to be because disappointing their expectations would create discomfort. The kind that says, I must honor the path I chose at 25, regardless of what I now know at 55, because changing would mean admitting that the path was wrong. Emerson does not think this is prudence. He does not think this is integrity. He thinks it is a form of cowardice dressed up as virtue. And he says so with a directness that has been making comfortable people deeply uncomfortable for 180 years. You are not the same person you were. Your understanding has grown. Your experience has altered your perception. The world has changed around you, and you have changed within it. Growing is not inconsistency. Refusing to grow in order to protect the image of someone who has always had it figured out, that is. Now the bridge. Because Emerson's world, Concord, Massachusetts, the 1840s, lectures delivered by lamplight to New England intellectuals can feel removed from the life you are living today, but the pressure he was writing against is identical to the one you feel. The pressure to be legible, to be the version of yourself that fits neatly into the categories other people have prepared for you, to not confuse or surprise or disappoint the audience that has been watching you perform a particular role for so long that some of them may have forgotten it was a performance. And what Emerson is asking, with the full weight of a man who had genuinely, at real cost, chosen his own ground over the comfortable path, is whether you are willing to do the same. Not dramatically, not all at once, not in a way that abandons your responsibilities or wounds the people who love you, but in the small, daily, accumulating practice of returning, one perception at a time, one honest thought at a time, one moment of trusting what you actually know over what you have been told to believe, to yourself. Here is what Emerson asks of you practically, today. First, locate your rejected thoughts. For the next week, pay attention to the moments when you have a perception, an idea, an opinion, and immediately qualify it, soften it, ask someone else to confirm it before you trust it. Write those moments down, not the thought you eventually expressed, the first thought, the one that arrived before the editing began. Emerson believed that the first thought, the unguarded, pre-social, pre-performance thought, is almost always closer to the truth than anything that comes after, because it has not yet been shaped by the question of how it will land. Collect your rejected thoughts for 1 week, then look at them. Notice whether the person in those unguarded thoughts is someone you recognize. Second, practice one act of honest expression. Choose one situation this week, one conversation, one piece of work, one decision, and bring to it the unedited version of what you actually think. Not aggressively, not without care for the people around you, but honestly, without the preemptive apology, without the softening that turns your actual position into something no one could object to and no one can quite locate. Emerson called this speaking your latent conviction, the thing you know, the thing that has been waiting, patient and persistent, beneath the surface of every polite and managed conversation, given, for once, full voice. Notice what that feels like. Notice whether the world, contrary to what your caution has been predicting, does not end.
Third, identify one foolish consistency. Where in your life were you continuing to be a previous version of yourself, not because that version is still true, but because changing it would require the uncomfortable work of explaining the change? The belief you have outgrown but still perform for the people who expect it, the preference you have changed but haven't mentioned, the direction your life was moving in that no longer feels like yours, but that you are maintaining out of loyalty to a person you are no longer quite sure you are. Name it. Write it down. You do not have to act on it today. But Emerson would say, seeing it clearly is the beginning of the only real freedom available to you. Fourth, spend 1 hour in what Emerson called the Noiseless Transaction. Go somewhere alone, without your phone, without an agenda or a destination or a productivity goal, and think. Not plan, not worry, not rehearse the conversations you need to have or the problems you need to solve. Think. In the original, wandering, unhurried, genuinely exploratory sense of the word. The way your mind moved when you were a child and no one was watching and there was nothing to prove and the whole afternoon was available and anything was possible. Emerson called this the source, the place where self-reliance is not a discipline, but a natural state, before the world arrived with its categories and its corrections and its very persuasive case that the most interesting parts of you should be managed more carefully. 1 hour, the noiseless transaction between you and the truest version of yourself you can currently reach. I want to close with the image of Emerson on a winter evening in Concord, 1838. He is about to deliver the address that will get him banned from Harvard for 30 years. He is going to stand before the students of the Harvard Divinity School and tell them, in the most prestigious academic setting available to him, that the church has been teaching them to look outward for what can only be found within. He knows what is coming. He knows the institution is not ready. He knows that what he is about to say will cost him relationships, reputation, comfort. The people in that room will not all be grateful. And he says it anyway. Not because he's reckless, not because he's arrogant, but because, having learned at real cost the difference between the voice that is his and the voice that belongs to the room, he can no longer pretend he doesn't know which is which. That is self-reliance. Not confidence, not certainty. The inability, after enough living, enough loss, enough hard-won clarity, to keep pretending that other people's truths are a substitute for your own. Here is the question Emerson leaves us with, not gently, not softly, with the directness of a man who paid for his own honesty and believed you could afford yours. What do you know in the place that existed before the editing began, before the room had a chance to weigh in, before you learned which parts of yourself required managing, that you have been pretending not to know? Leave that in the comments, because that answer, your first, unguarded, unsoftened answer, is the iron string, and it has been vibrating in you your entire life. I'll see you in the next one.